Hi, this is Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. We're going to talk about why we got Spelljammer Adventures in Space right now. Okay, so Dungeons and Dragons is incredibly complicated, and there's a ramp up, right? So, how is Dungeons and Dragons generally played as a new dungeon master and/or new Dungeons and Dragons players come into Dungeons and Dragons? Well, the first thing that happens is people actually meet Dungeons and Dragons exactly where Christopher Perkins just put Dungeons and Dragons, which is just Dungeons and Dragons. When people come in, they don't have any idea of the different eras of Dungeons and Dragons. They don't have any idea of the literally hundreds of core rule books, hundreds of Dungeons and Dragons canon rule books that go back all the way to the late the canon Dungeons and Dragons hardbacks that go all the way back to the late 70s, right? So they just come in, and generally they're dealing with active Dungeons and Dragons. They literally have bought it off the shelf at Target, right? That might be what they were like there buying sheets, and they bought the player's handbook and the DMG and the monster manual, or a starter set, right? And at that point they're going to be dealing with Perkinian Dungeons and Dragons, right, which is 2014 to now, right? And Perkinian Dungeons and Dragons has a huge goal, and that was to rescue Dungeons and Dragons from Heinsoonian Dungeons and Dragons. Heinsoonian Dungeons and Dragons was Dungeons and Dragons from 2008 to 2014. And the difference between Perkinian Dungeons & Dragons and Heinsoonian Dungeons & Dragons is Perkinian Dungeons & Dragons reestablished majority goodwill for Dungeons & Dragons from the D&D community. During Heinsoonian Dungeons & Dragons, it's the only time this ever happened in all of the history of Dungeons & Dragons, but majority goodwill from the Dungeons & Dragons community was no longer extended. The Dungeons & Dragons community no longer had majority. It no longer had 51% of the DMs and players that had goodwill toward Dungeons & Dragons. There was huge uproar over Heinsoonian Dungeons & Dragons. Pretty much the community, it split the community right in half. And some people liked it, and some people flat out hated it. And there was a point where that some people was 51%. And it opened a door for Paizo to bring in Pathfinder, for Pathfinder to outsell Heinsoonian Dungeons and Dragons during that period, right? So you have these people who come in and they engage with active Dungeons and Dragons, Perkinian Dungeons and Dragons, and then they realize it's all just Dungeons and Dragons, and they move to full Dungeons and Dragons, right? Which is just Dungeons and Dragons, being able to mix freely any of the player's handbooks, monster manuals, dungeon master guides, all the way back from as early as 1978 all the way up today, and actual full Dungeons and Dragons is, Sally the Dungeon Master is using a 1993 DMG, and and then Becky is bringing a Heinsoonian player's handbook and a Dancian monster manual, right, as a player, right? And Charlize is bringing a 2014 player's handbook and a 2006 monster manual, right? And so this is, and so players, and just being able to use every single Dungeons and Dragons canon hardback throughout the entire history of Dungeons and Dragons, because it's just Dungeons and Dragons. It's the same player's handbook from 1978 to today. There's just different material in it. It's still the player's handbook. It's still Dungeons and Dragons. It's still D20. It's the same, right? But getting somebody to where they can play full Dungeons and Dragons, every book, every Dungeons and Dragons canon hardback printed from 1978 all the way up to today, that takes an incredibly skilled dungeon master and incredibly skilled player's handbook who have experience. So they have to have, they quite literally have to have the experience in order to do this, right? So you have this going forward, right? And they're moving forward and establishing that, establishing the game, right? So the reason we got Spelljammer right now is to allow a progression into Dungeons and Dragons. So what is that progression? So if somebody started like a year ago, right, what they would have come into is they would have come into active Dungeons and Dragons, Perkinian Dungeons and Dragons, and they would know Forgotten Realms as a setting. They would know Eberron as a setting, because there's a book for it. They would know Ravenloft as a setting, Curse of Strahd, Von Richten's Guide to Ravenloft as a setting. They would know Exandria as a setting. This is Dungeons and Dragons to them. And there was a period, and we had this period, and Spelljammer was not introduced to active Dungeons and Dragons. And the reason why is I think Christopher Perkins wanted to give everybody a chance to explore the Forgotten Realms, to explore Eberron, to explore Ravenloft, to explore Exandria, right? And to get to know those cultures, right? So why are we getting Spelljammer right now? Well, the reason why is people have had a chance to see active Dungeons and Dragons, to see what are the most default primary worlds, right? And to experience them and to have, fun and experience these different realms for their different flavors and their different experiences. But we're getting Spelljammer right now, and the reason we're getting that Spelljammer right now is because the biggest thing that's happening here right now is the Realm Wars. That's why we got this right now, right? So once you have players who understand Eberron, players who understand Exandria, players who understand the Forgotten Realms, players who understand Ravenloft, you can let it whip. And here it goes. What's going to happen? Well, the ramifications of spelljamming ships freely exploring the astral plane, which contains the astral sea, which contains wild space systems, which contain wild space, realm space synonymous to wild space systems, right? Realm space systems, right? Once you have that all in place, Realm Wars. What's going to happen? It's pretty obvious, right? So let's talk about Exandria. Xhorhas, the monster races, right? All the races that are not traditional. So Dwendalia is a nation there, right? And it has the Tolkien races. It has the human race. It has the humans, the dwarves, and the elves. And there is a war going on. Matthew Mercer says, hey, Exandria's in the middle of a war, right? The monstrous races, the orcs, the goblins, the bugbears, right? They are at war with Dwendalia. And down so Dwendalia and Xhorhas and the Drow, they are all warring. They are making war again amongst each other. They are making war amongst each other, right? And then the Menagerie Coast, you have the Clovis Concord who's selling weapons to both sides. Well, what do you think is going to happen when Warforged starts showing up in Exandria on a GIF bombard? I can tell you what's going to happen, right? The Warforged are going to go, hey, we from Eberron, right? And the Warforged, yeah, we down with the Kalistar, we down with the Changelings, we down with the Shifters. But what about all those humans, dwarves, and elves, all in their dragon-marked houses, right? They've been keeping us down. They forged us to do war for them. And here we come, and we find Exandria, this world rich with resources, rich with magic. And what is happening? The humans, the dwarves, and the elves are taking the other races and trying to put them down. The Warforged, the Kalistar, the Shifters, the Changelings are going to ally immediately with the goblins, with the drow, with the bugbears, with the orcs, and they're going to take it to Dwendalia. And that is the spark that will allow the Realm Wars to burn, right? But you cannot arrive at the Realm Wars. There is no meaning for Eberron going to war with Exandria. There is no meaning for Keith Baker's work to slam directly into Matthew Mercer's work until people understand what those worlds are. You can't break it until you've shown that you can make it, right? You can't mix. The war doesn't have meaning if these realms do not have meaning to your players. So there needed to be a period, 2014 to 2022, where each realm had a chance to stand on its own and give adventures to Dungeons & Dragons players, right? But that time is over, and the realm wars are sparked, right? And the realm wars are where we are at now, moving into a time of conflict, where the realms that your players have enjoyed will burn. That's the timing of the Dungeons & Dragons design team. That is the reason we got Spelljammer's Adventure in Space now. We had to let it sit. The omelet had, before we, there had to be a time where people had a chance to see these realms unbroken before we could break these realms in the realm wars. Right? All that's my humble opinion. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.